Cow dung custard. A lot of kids have nicknames like Mouse or Bluey or Freckles. Those sort of nicknames are okay. My nickname was Cow Dung Kid. Can you imagine it? The Cow Dung Kid. What a name to get stuck with. It was all my father's fault, him and his vegetable garden. Don't get me wrong though, Dad was a good bloke, a real good bloke. He brought me up all on his own. I didn't have a mother, so he can take all the credit for the way I turned out. Dad loved to grow vegetables. His vegetable garden was his pride and joy. Every year he went into competition. He always won lots of prizes for the best vegetables. He won prizes for the biggest pumpkins and the juiciest tomatoes. He grew the biggest and the best veggies in the whole town. He once grew a pumpkin that was so big it took 4 men to lift it. His peas were as big as golf balls, and his beans were as long as your arm. No kidding. The whole yard was filled with vegetables. He had long rows of them. Every row had a little sign at the end, and each sign was the name of the vegetable that was growing, and the batch number. This batch number told him which type of manure he had used. Batch 24 meant 3 shovels of cow dung and 1 shovel of horse droppings. Batch 14 was 2 shovels of horse droppings, 1 shovel of sheep droppings, and 3 shovels of pig droppings. Dad had every type of manure you could think of. He had duck and goose, and kangaroo and wombat. He had bat and emu. He even had snake droppings. And guess who helped him to collect it? You're not wrong. It was me. Every weekend I had to go and collect cow dung. Every weekend, without fail. We lived right in the middle of the town, and I had to get a wheelbarrow and walk out to the country. Then I had to fill it up with cow dung. It had to be fresh. Nice and sloppy, Dad would say. Make sure it's nice and sloppy. And I had to walk back through town with the wheelbarrow full of sloppy cow dung. I wasn't on my own though. Oh no, I had company. About 5,000 flies came with me. They were like a black cloud following me along the street. Everyone could see me. I felt like the whole town was watching me and my flies. I got my nickname of the Cow Dung Kid on one of these trips. It was Christmas Day. Dad's boss at work grew vegetables too, but they were never as good as Dad's. He didn't have a son to go and get manure. So Dad had a bright idea. He decided to give the boss a surprise, a Christmas present. He wanted me to go get manure for his boss. Just tip it out and leave it for him to find, said Dad. He'll be tickled pink. I might even get a raise out of this. But Dad, I pleaded, not on Christmas Day. Everyone will be looking. I can't do it. I just can't. He gave me one of those sorrowful looks. He shook his head and said, After all I've done for you, Greg, you won't even help me out with this one little thing. I gave in and went. I didn't want to spend all Christmas feeling guilty. I set out at the crack of dawn. I didn't even open my presents. I wanted to get it over and done with before people were out of bed. But it was no use. All the kids in town were up early. They followed me and my cow dung along the street. They were all on new bikes and scooters that they had got for Christmas. They thought it was a great joke. Look at what Santa bought Greg, shouted some bright spark. Everyone laughed. As I went along, more and more kids started following me. After a while, there were about 50 of them. Someone else yelled out, King of the Flies! Greg is King of the Flies! The Cow Dung Kids! Said another voice. Another laugh went up. They all started yelling it out. Cow Dung Kid! Cow Dung Kid! It was embarrassing. I ran faster and faster. Some of the cow dung fell out, but I didn't care. I just kept running. At last I reached the boss's house. I tipped out the cow dung on his doorstep, right against the door. That way he would get a surprise when he opened the door, and Dad would get all the glory. Anyway, that's how I got the name of the Cow Dung Kid. And after all that trouble, Dad's boss wasn't even grateful. He said something about cow dung all over his carpet. There was no understanding some people. He didn't even say thanks. Flies, flies, flies. They hung around our house all day and night. It was the smell of manure. The smell attracted them. There were flies everywhere. They came down the chimney and under the doors. People had no trouble finding our house. If anyone asked where we lived, they were always told the same thing: just stop at the house with the flies. The neighbors didn't like the flies. They were always going crook, so Dad gave them vegetables to keep them quiet. He gave them giant carrots and potatoes. They liked them so much that they only complained about the really bad days. This usually happened when Dad made a very smelly batch, like batch 72. Dad kept each batch of manure in a large rubbish bin. He had at least 200 of them in the backyard. The worse they smelt, the more flies hung around them. The ones with a really bad smell were kept down by the back fence, away from the house. Mr. Farley lived in the house at the back. He didn't like us much. He never spoke to us. He was a pretty crabby bloke, actually. I could never figure out why. The trouble all started with batch 72. It was the strongest batch that Dad had ever made. It had bat droppings and rabbit droppings and wombat droppings. And I think there was a bit of lizard and pataru, but the main ingredient was cow dung. Dad also threw in some rotten pumpkins. They were bright yellow. He added water and stirred the mix up. It went smooth and yellow. "It's like custard," he said. "Cow dung custard." It was a really smelly batch. Really, really smelly. It was the worst one that Dad had made. "Good," said Dad. "The more it smells, the better it works. I'll grow some great potatoes with this batch." He took out a pen and wrote "cow dung custard" on the side of the bin. The flies were already starting to gather, so I decided to go inside, out of the way. The smell was bad, and it was just getting worse. I could smell batch 72 as I went to bed, even though it was at the bottom of the yard. I knew there was going to be trouble with the neighbors over this. Batch 72 looked like custard, but it sure didn't smell like it. The next day I woke early. I knew something was wrong. I could hardly breathe, and I felt sick. It was the smell of the cow dung custard. It was the most terrible smell I'd ever come across. It was so bad that you could almost see it. Every breath was painful. I put a handkerchief over my mouth and rushed to the window. All the neighbors were up. They were outside our house. No one could sleep. They were all dressed in their PJs, and they were all holding handkerchiefs over their noses. Some of them were even making groaning noises. They were trying to shout. Some people were waving their fists at the house. They were all mad at us. I went and woke Dad up. He has a poor sense of smell. He's the only person in the street who was still asleep. He looked out of the window. "Amazing," he said. "Amazing, look at that. There's not one fly to be seen." He didn't even notice the people. He was looking for flies. I couldn't believe it. But what he said was true. There were no flies hanging around. They were all dead. The ground was covered in dead flies. They were like a black carpet all over the lawn. The smell was so bad it had killed all of the flies. "Oh, you'd better had to do something," I told him. "That stuff might be dangerous. And everyone's still mad at us. The neighbors are all angry." He looked out of the window. Everyone was running away. The smell was so awful that they couldn't stand it. "Oh, you're right," said Dad. "You stay here, and I'll go and see what I can do." He walked down to the bottom of the yard. I could hear the bodies of the dead flies crunching under his feet. I was glad he told me to stay inside. I think I would have fainted if I'd got any closer to that smell. It was lucky for Dad that he couldn't smell very well at all. I watched him out of the window. He drove our old truck into the backyard. He tried to lift the cow dung custard into it, but it was too heavy. He had to tip it out into a lot of buckets. Then he lifted him up onto the truck. After he put all the buckets onto the truck, he came back into the house. He had yellow stuff all over his dressing gown. "Oh, don't come in," I said. "Please don't come in." He yelled at me through the window. "I'm going to the sea with it. I can't think of anywhere else to put it. You stay here, Greg." He needn't have worried. I was in no way going anywhere near that cow dung custard. Then I noticed something terrible. Dad's hair had fallen out. He was completely bald. Didn't have one hair left on his head. Even his eyebrows had fallen out. That cow dung custard was strong. Too strong. Dad jumped into the truck and drove out the front gate. I watched him drive down the road. There wasn't a person in sight. They were all inside with their heads under their pillows. and as he went by, the dogs in the street ran off yelping with their tails between their legs. Dad tipped the cow dung custard over a cliff and into the sea. For the next 2 weeks there were dead fish floating around everywhere. The town we lived in is called Lakes Entrance. It's a fishing town. All the fishermen were cross with Dad for killing all the fish. The people in the town were mad at him too. The smell hung around for weeks. Dad took a lot of vegetables around to them, trying to make it up. Mr. Jackson lived next door. He told Dad to go away. "Oh, I don't want your vegetables," he said. "And I don't want your manure or your smells. Why don't you go and live out on a farm, then you can be as smelly as you want." He had a point. I was getting sick of it too. The kids at school called me Cow Dung Kid. Everyone knew us and where we lived. All the houses in the street had "For Sale" notices on the front yard. No one wanted to live near us, and I didn't blame them. "Listen, Dad," I said. Let's go and live somewhere else, on a farm. Then I won't have to go and get manure. You'll have all you want, and there won't be any neighbours to complain." Dad looked sad. He nodded his bald head. "Oh, I'd like to move to a farm, Greg, but we can't afford it. Farms cost a lot of money, and we're broke. We will have to stay here. But I will do one thing for you. I'll get rid of the smell. I'll find a way to stop the manure smelling. It'll be called Batch 100. Batch 100 will have no smell, and it's the only one I'll use." I went off shaking my head. Poor old Dad. He meant well, but I knew he couldn't do it. How could anyone make up a batch of manure that didn't smell? Dad tried everything he could think of to make Batch 100. He put in flowers, he put in soap, he put in perfume. But he just couldn't stop the manure smelling. Our house was as smelly as ever. Even the school bus wouldn't come down our street anymore. One good thing did happen. Dad's hair started growing back. It was thick and as black as it had always been. Then one day he did it. He made Batch 100. You couldn't smell a thing. It wasn't like the cow dung custard. You didn't even know it was there. I was rapt. I thought our problems were over. But I was wrong. Batch 100 had other problems. It was the worst one ever. People couldn't smell Batch 100, but the flies could. Flies can smell better than people can. Something like a dog whistle. Dogs can hear them and people can't. Well, flies could smell Batch 100 when people couldn't. The flies came in their thousands, in their millions. The air was thick with them. The sound of their buzzing was terrible to hear. They crawled over your face, and into your nose and in your eyes. They were so thick that you couldn't see the sun. After a while it started to grow dark, and it was only lunchtime. Dad and I were in the backyard. After a while I couldn't see the house, or the back fence. The flies were just too thick. I'd never seen anything like it before. There were so many flies in the air that I couldn't find Dad. "Greg," he shouted, "go back to the house! Quick, this is dangerous!" I couldn't see where he was. I couldn't see where anything was. I looked down at the ground. There were so many flies in the air that I couldn't see my feet. I had to squint to stop them getting into my eyes. I started to walk slowly where I thought the house was. I bumped into something large. It was the truck. I could tell what it was by the feel of it. I was going the wrong way. I turned around and tried a different direction. Then I heard Dad's voice. I could just make it out over the buzzing of the flies. "Greg, Greg, this way," he called. I followed the sound of his voice. I walked very slowly to make sure I didn't bump into anything. At last I reached Dad. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. He was standing on the doorstep. "Get ready," he shouted. "I'm going to open the door. When I say go, rush in as quick as you can. I'll slam the door after us." "Go!" he yelled. We both fell into the room. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the door shut with a bang. "Put on the light," said Dad. I switched on the light. The room was full of flies, but it wasn't as bad as outside. At least we could see. I looked at the window. It was black. Millions of flies were crawling all over it. "Quick," Dad said. "Block up all the cracks under the doors. I'll cover up the chimney. We've got to stop them coming in." I started stuffing towels and rags under the door. Dad covered up the fireplace with a piece of cardboard. We had all the cracks blocked up and found some fly spray. We had plenty of fly spray in the house. Something we used a lot. It took 3 cans to kill them all. We ran upstairs to look out of the top windows. They were all black too. Couldn't see outside at all. We were trapped in our own house by millions and millions of flies. Dad was upset. "Oh, this is bad, Greg," he said. "Very bad. Batch 100 is much too strong. Every fly in the country must be here. It's all my fault. We've got to get rid of those flies." Just then the phone rang. Dad picked it up. It was Mr. Jackson. He was shouting. I could hear every word, even though the flies were making such a horrible noise outside. "You've done it this time, Moffat," he yelled. "The whole town is blacked out with flies. Nobody can get out of their house. It's pitch black in the middle of the day. It's all your fault, you and your manure. You'd better do something, and quick. You brought the flies here, now you get rid of them." The phone went dead. He had hung up. "Oh, what can we do?" said Dad. "How can we get rid of them?" He hung his head in his hands, the poor bloke. I really felt sorry for him. We both sat there thinking. Outside the flies were getting thicker and thicker. "Fly spray," I said. "No good," he told me. "There wasn't enough fly spray in the world to kill this lot. We need something stronger, something really powerful." We sat there looking at each other. We both had the answer at the same time. "Cow dung custard," we shouted together. "That's it," said Dad. "The smell is so strong that it kills flies. I'll mix up a special batch." "But what about the smell, Dad?" I asked. "Can't help the smell. It's an emergency. The whole town is blacked out with flies. We have to do something." "But how can we make it?" I asked him. "Can't see a thing out there. Can hardly breathe. The flies get in your nose and in your mouth, and wouldn't be able to make the cow dung custard. It's as black as pitch." We both fell silent again. We just sat there and looked at each other. Then Dad had an idea. "The beekeeper's outfit," he yelled. "We can wear the beekeeper's outfit." Once Dad used to keep bees. He still had the outfit for smoking out the bees. It had a hat and net to stop the bees from stinging him. "But what about me? You can't do it on your own. You'll have to make a heck of a lot. I'll have to come too." "Your wetsuit. You can wear your wetsuit, and put on the goggles. You can wear the snorkel to stop the flies from getting into your mouth." We dressed up in our outfits. Dad had his hat and bee net. I had my wetsuit, goggles and snorkel. I felt silly, but as Dad said, this was an emergency. We tied a rope to each other so that we wouldn't get lost. Then we walked over to the door and opened it. 1,000,000 flies poured into the room. Everything went black. The light was on, but we couldn't even see it. I felt a pull on the rope. Dad was moving out into the backyard. I couldn't see him, so I just followed the rope. Flies swirled around us in one huge black cloud. We walked slowly. We didn't want to fall over. At last we reached the back fence. I felt Dad's hand on my arm. He was shouting at me. It was difficult to hear him because of the loud buzzing of the flies. "Help me tip over batch 100, he yelled. "Then we'll empty another 15 bins. We'll need at least 16 bins of cow dung custard to kill all these flies. They must be covering the whole town." We struggled over to batch 100. The flies were all trying to get to it. They were so thick that it was like walking through a river. I plunged my arm through the sea of flies and pushed over the bin. 1,000,000,000 flies rose into the air as it tipped over. The buzz was so loud that it hurt my ears, and the wind from their wings blew me over. We stood up and felt our way over to the other bins. It took a long time to push them all over and empty out the manure. In the end, we had 16 empty bins. I felt Dad's hand on my arm again. "We'll have to untie the rope," he said. "It will take a long time to mix 16 bins of cow dung custard. We have to hurry. The flies are getting thicker. Every fly in the country will be here soon." "I'm scared, Dad," I told him. "I might get lost if you untie the rope." "Feel your way along the fence," he said. "When you get to the manure heap, try to fill up the wheelbarrow with cow dung. Put 10 shovelfuls into each bin. I'll put in the rest of the mixture." His voice was shaking. I knew he was scared too. So I undid the rope and followed the fence into the manure heap. It took a long time, but at last I managed to put cow dung in every bin. Flies kept bumping into my goggles. Felt as if someone was throwing rice at my face. Every now and then I bumped into Dad. He was tipping all sorts of things into the bins. Once he dropped a rotten pumpkin on my foot. Then something wonderful happened. A shocking stink filled the air. It was the first batch of Cowdung custard. "Hooray!" I shouted. I was really happy, even though the smell was so bad. I didn't know whether it was working. I couldn't tell if it was killing the flies. There just seemed to be as many as ever. Dad came over to me. "Go back to the house," he yelled. "If this works, there are going to be dead flies everywhere. You might get buried if you stay here." "No way," I told him. "I'm staying with you." After a while we had 2 bins of Cowdung custard mixed up. The stink grew stronger and stronger. I felt ill, but we had to keep going. We made one at a time. By the time we made 10 bins, the smell was so strong we had to stop. "We can't go on," Dad said. "I'm going to faint if I don't get away from this smell." "Hey!" I suddenly shouted. "I can see you!" I could just make out the shape of Dad and his bee-net. There weren't so many flies in the air. The Cowdung custard was working. It was killing some of the flies. I looked at the ground. It was covered in flies. Some of them were dead. Some of them were lying on their backs, kicking their legs in the air. There was a thick carpet of flies all over the lawn. Then I felt my head. My hair was full of dead flies. They were starting to fall down out of the sky. It was raining flies. "Quick," Dad said. "Back to the house. We'll be buried alive if we don't hurry." We ran back to the house. Flies were pouring down around us. Dead bodies were so deep we couldn't move properly. They came up to my ankles, then up to my knees. Dad reached the door first, pushed it open and fell inside. "Help!" I screamed. "I'm stuck!" The flies were up to my armpits, and they were still falling. I was scared out of my wits. I didn't want to drown in a sea of flies. I couldn't move backwards or forwards. Dad still had the rope wrapped around his waist. He started to undo it. "Quick, I'm going under!" I yelled. The flies were getting deeper and deeper. They were nearly up to my mouth. He threw the rope over, and I grabbed it. But it was too late. The dead flies were right over my head. I was buried under the bodies of flies. It was lucky that I had the goggles and snorkel on. The snorkel poked up above the flies. It enabled me to breathe, but I couldn't see a thing. Everything was black. Then I felt strong hands pulling me up. It was Dad. He had followed the rope and dug down to me. He dragged me across the top of the flies and into the house, then he slammed the door. It was much better in the house. The flies were only knee-deep. At least we could walk around. We went upstairs as quickly as we could and looked out of the window. It was still raining flies, but it had started to ease off. At last it stopped. Every fly was dead. The Cowdung custard had killed the lot. The smell of it was terrible. Our place was on top of a hill. We could see the whole town. Every house was covered in dead flies. They covered the road, and the cars, and the trees, and the gardens. It looked like a snow-covered village, but with black snow. There was not a person in sight. Everyone was trapped inside their houses. The whole town was silent, and over it all hung the terrible smell of Cowdung custard. Dad looked at me. "Good grief, Greg," he said. "All of your hair is gone." I felt the top of my head. It was smooth. I was as bald as a badger, and I rushed into the mirror. "Oh no," I groaned. "Not that. Not bald." Then I looked at Dad. He was bald again too. All of his new hair had fallen out. "It's the Cowdung custard," I said. "It's so strong it makes your hair fall out." I looked out of the window again. It was still very quiet. 4 or 5 people were out. They were trying to clear the flies away from their front doors. It was hard work. They were up to their armpits in flies. I looked at them more closely. There was something strange about them, but I couldn't work out what it was. Then I got a shock. They were all bald. I knew there was going to be big trouble over this. A bit later we heard the sound of a motor. It sounded like a tractor, but it wasn't. It was a bulldozer. It was clearing the streets. It pushed the flies to the side of the road in huge banks. Behind the bulldozer was a police car. They came slowly up our street. People were following them. Lots of bald people. Men and women and children. They were all angry. They were mad. They were yelling and screaming at us. The bulldozer stopped at our house. It turned around and came through our garden. It cleared a path up to the front door, then it stopped. A bald policeman stepped down from it. He had a handkerchief tied around his nose to stop the smell. He came into the house without knocking. "Quick," he said, "get into the police car. I'll have to get you out of here before the mob gets you. I don't know what they'll do if they get their hands on you. They might tear you to pieces." He was worried, very worried. So was I. He pushed us into the car and started driving down the street. Crowds of bald people surrounded the car. They threw things at the car and tried to open the doors. They wanted to pull us out. Some even threw handfuls of flies at the car. I could see why they were mad. Everyone was bald, even the cats and dogs. Not one person in the town had hair left anywhere on their body. In the end, they got us safely through town. They took us down to Melbourne, which was a long way away. Then they let us go. Dad and I were both upset. He knew one thing for sure: could never go back to Lakes Entrance again. There was a big fuss about the whole thing. It was in the papers and on TV. Dad and I changed our names so that no one could find us. Then it all died down and people started to forget about it. There was a shortage of wigs in Australia for a while, but after a couple of months everyone's hair grew back. As time passed, people started to think it was funny. I'm writing this next to the swimming pool on our farm. Dad is out front cleaning our Rolls Royce. Things worked out quite well for us in the end. Dad made a lot of money out of an invention. It's yellow stuff for getting rid of hair. People buy it in tubes. They put it on their legs. It works really well and it smells lovely. It's called CDC Hair Remover. Everyone likes it. They think it's wonderful. But no one knows what CDC stands for.